Over the decades, the women who guarded the Nazi concentration camps became the feminine face of destruction. Within a machine where torment and mass elimination were part of everyday life, these women didn't just follow instructions, they improved them and made them more lethal. Wielding instruments of punishment and displaying faces devoid of all mercy, they turned the lives of thousands of inmates into one of limitless torture. The names of Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, and Bergen-Belsen resonated with terror when their presence was mentioned. These women never remained mere witnesses to extermination, but became central elements in its execution. They decided between the life and death of prisoners, and at times their sadism went far beyond any instructions they had received. They created new ways to inflict pain, taking violence to extremes beyond all previous imagination. What exactly were the atrocities these women perpetrated inside the concentration camps? What factors drove them to surpass the limits of simple, blind obedience? The guardians of the Third Reich, women in the service of destruction. The inclusion of women within the Nazi concentration camp apparatus is part of a poorly researched but crucial historical episode in the Third Reich's extermination machinery. The Nazi administration, characterized by its methodical approach to eliminating groups considered undesirable, expanded its influence to penetrate every facet of society, including the repressive mechanisms of the concentration camps. Although the military organization of these complexes had not initially planned for the inclusion of women in command roles, the geographical expansion of the Reich and the urgent demand to transfer male soldiers to theaters of operations after 1941 drastically altered this scenario. The SS, the paramilitary corporation responsible for operating the camps, began active female recruitment campaigns to compensate for the shortage of male personnel, establishing auxiliary divisions of women who gradually assumed increasingly crucial responsibilities in the administration of terror and annihilation. This recruitment strategy exemplified the contradictory Nazi perception of German women, revered as guardians of the home and exemplary parents, yet simultaneously required as effective participants in building the authoritarian state. Calls for recruitment were consistently disseminated through local publications, offering attractive salaries and prospects for career advancement. For a considerable number of women, particularly those with basic education or from rural backgrounds, these proposals represented especially attractive alternatives in a context marked by economic constraints. The demographic spectrum of candidates included diverse backgrounds: dedicated housewives, hairstylists, healthcare workers, educators, and industrial workers who, motivated by ideological convictions or practical considerations, joined an apparatus that would mold them as perpetrators of atrocities. Ravensbrück, the main women's concentration camp located approximately 90 kilometers from Berlin, served as a training institute for future female guards. At this facility, they underwent an intensive 4-week training program that combined ideological brainwashing with practical education. They mastered methods of domination through physical and mental violence, methodical dehumanization of inmates, and unconditional submission to the hierarchical structure. The training program emphasized the importance of perceiving the captives not as individuals but as disposable figures within a larger system. Their training included mastery of punitive tools such as whips and canes, education on slave labor surveillance, structuring selective processes to determine who would continue to work and who would be eliminated, and maintaining order through psychological intimidation. In contrast to their male counterparts, whose training focused on military elements, women underwent specialized training to control prisoners in the women's divisions of the camps. After completing their training, these women were distributed to various camps such as Auschwitz, Stutthof, Bergen-Belsen, and multiple subsidiary facilities. Their influence was especially noticeable in the areas designated for women, where they maintained total control over the prisoners. Among their most atrocious responsibilities were participating in selective processes for gas chambers, supervising slave labor until physical collapse, carrying out extremely brutal punishments, and managing circumstances that practically guaranteed high mortality rates. Figures such as Maria Mandel and Elisabeth Volkenrath distinguished themselves by their exceptional effectiveness in executing genocidal strategies. Their behavior, despite being part of a hierarchical and structured system, displayed a level of cruelty that far exceeded simple compliance with higher-level directives. These figures became essential components of the Nazi extermination apparatus, directly contributing to the suffering and death of millions of individuals. What was particularly disturbing about these female guards, as would be demonstrated in subsequent accounts and court cases, was that many displayed a dedication that far exceeded merely following orders. They developed their own methods of cruelty, developing techniques of torture and punishment that had never been specifically instructed. This aspect of individual choice within a coercive system challenges simplistic explanations of women's involvement in the Holocaust. Analyzing the roles played by these women provides fundamental insights into the human capacity to adapt to systems of institutionalized cruelty. Their evolution demonstrates radicalization processes through which seemingly normal individuals, with no prior history of violent behavior, can progressively metamorphose into perpetrators of atrocities when specific elements combine. Ideological indoctrination, system pressure, the methodical dehumanization of the other, and opportunities to exercise authority without moral constraints. The transformation of women's involvement in the Holocaust demonstrates how, under extreme conditions, these women were shaped by Nazi ideology until they evolved into active agents of a system designed to eliminate millions of lives. Their training and roles within the repressive mechanism transformed them not only into facilitators of the extermination process, but also into direct perpetrators of violence and death. Research on their involvement provides essential insights into understanding how ordinary individuals can be transformed into perpetrators of atrocities under specific circumstances. Bergen-Belsen, the camp where death became woman. Bergen-Belsen is a fundamental example for examining the extreme brutality of female guards within the Nazi concentration camp system. Although less notorious than Auschwitz or Treblinka, this complex in Lower Saxony, Germany, evolved into one of the most catastrophic theaters of the Holocaust, accumulating more than 70,000 victims without requiring permanent gas chambers. The female guards played a crucial role in managing this earthly hell, where death was spread primarily through starvation, epidemics, and methodical abuse. The origins of Bergen-Belsen date back to 1940, when it operated as a detention center for French and Belgian prisoners of war. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, it was reconfigured as Stalag 11C, intended to house Soviet prisoners. By March 1942, approximately 41,000 Soviet prisoners had succumbed there as a result of starvation, epidemics, and exhaustion caused by slave labor. The critical moment came in 1943 when the SS Main Office for Economic Administration took over operations, transforming it into a concentration camp in the strictest sense. As the Red Army advanced from the Eastern Front, thousands of inmates were transferred to the heart of the Reich. In August 1944, a division of Bergen-Belsen was established as a women's camp, where thousands of prisoners evacuated primarily from Auschwitz and Ravensbrück were grouped. The circumstances in this area were particularly horrendous: extreme overcrowding, completely inadequate food supplies, and the uncontrolled spread of diseases such as typhus. Parallel to these prisoner transfers were the arrival of numerous SS guards, many of whom had previously been assigned to camps on the Eastern Front. At Bergen-Belsen, a particular group of guards gained a sinister reputation for their methodical brutality. Elisabeth Volkenrath, who had actively participated in selections for the gas chambers at Auschwitz, assumed the position of chief supervisor of the women's camp. Eyewitness accounts portray her intentionally throwing an elderly woman down a workshop staircase, causing her immediate death. She routinely appropriated medicines intended for the sick and organized punishment sessions during head counts, forcing weakened prisoners to collapse or die. Johanna Bormann, considerably older than her colleagues and known as the woman with the dogs, used a trained German shepherd to attack prisoners under her command. Survivors described how she allowed her animal to savagely attack women for minor transgressions, such as picking up fallen vegetables, causing injuries that frequently proved fatal due to infection, given the deliberate lack of medical attention. Herta Bothe, nicknamed the sadist of Stutthof for her behavior at the camp, was intimidating with her 6 feet 1 inch stature. She oversaw work crews collecting wood, methodically beating weakened prisoners who couldn't keep up. During her subsequent trial, she admitted to slapping prisoners but denied using instruments to beat them, contradicting multiple independent testimonies that identified her as responsible for fatal beatings. Daily existence under the watchful eye of these guards unfolded in an atmosphere of constant terror. The prisoners faced endless counts where they had to remain upright for hours without regard for the weather or their physical weakness. Arbitrary sanctions, such as kneeling on sharp gravel for hours or remaining barefoot in the snow, were applied for minor transgressions, such as an improperly fastened button or a look interpreted as defiant. The final months of the war triggered a catastrophic deterioration in camp conditions. The massive influx of prisoners evacuated from the east created extreme overcrowding, while food supplies were drastically reduced. Diseases spread unchecked due to the deliberate absence of adequate sanitary facilities and medicine. The wardens actively contributed to this situation by systematically confiscating food, denying medical care, and applying punishments that accelerated the physical deterioration of already weakened prisoners. March 1945 marked the deadliest point in Bergen-Belsen's history, with approximately 18,000 deaths documented in a single month. When British troops liberated the camp on April 15, 1945, they found apocalyptic scenes: thousands of unburied corpses strewn across the grounds, barracks crammed with dying people, and survivors so weakened they could barely move. One British officer described the scene as an acre of ground covered with the dead and dying, impossible to distinguish one from another. Amidst this panorama of death, the British encountered numerous SS guards, including several female guards who had chosen to remain in the camp while others escaped. These women were immediately arrested and, as a first measure of immediate justice, forced to participate in the camp cleanup. Photographs documenting female guards carrying corpses to mass graves became iconic images that circulated globally, offering a first glimpse of accountability for the crimes committed. The uniqueness of the Bergen-Belsen case lay in the fact that it was taken with a large portion of its personnel still on the premises, a situation that would later facilitate the holding of the infamous Bergen-Belsen trials, marking the first occasion on which female supervisors would face systematic prosecution for their atrocities. This unusual situation, considering that the vast majority of concentration camps had been vacated in sufficient time for the perpetrators to escape, would transform Bergen-Belsen into a key focal point for legally establishing the record of female involvement in the atrocities of the Holocaust. Bergen-Belsen demonstrates how the female guards were not mere observers or marginal participants, but essential elements of the Nazi system of terror. Their daily brutality, combined with the deliberate administration of inhumane conditions, created an environment where death was virtually inevitable. Survivor testimonies revealed that these women not only followed orders but frequently demonstrated their own initiative in the application of cruelty, contradicting later exculpatory narratives based on obedience to authority. Irma Gries and Maria Mandel, the faces of inhuman terror. Auschwitz, the heart of the Nazi genocide, also served as a theater where certain female guards gained infamy for exhibiting levels of cruelty beyond all human understanding. Among these figures, Irma Gries and Maria Mandel embody opposing but equally destructive models of female perpetrators, the former a product of youth radicalization under National Socialism, the latter a competent manager who directed her professional ambition toward the systematic execution of extermination. Their personal stories demonstrate how the Nazi apparatus managed to turn ordinary women into essential components of the genocidal machine. Irma Gries, born on October 7, 1923, to a rural family in Mecklenburg, epitomizes the typical example of premature radicalization under Nazi influence. After leaving school at 14 and unsuccessfully attempting to train as a nurse, she discovered a sense of belonging and identity in the League of German Girls, BDM. The premature death of her mother and a family environment where her father sympathized with National Socialist ideas created the favorable context for her adhesion to the regime's extremist ideology. In 1942, at just 18 years old, Gries voluntarily enlisted in the SS Gefolge, SS Women's Retinue, initially assigned to Ravensbrück as a training guard. Her young age did not prevent her from displaying extraordinary skill in violent discipline, which led to her transfer to Auschwitz-Birkenau in March 1943. There, she initially oversaw female work crews, but her commitment to maintaining terror earned her rapid promotions until she became the supervisor of Camp C, which housed mainly Hungarian deportees. What set Grese apart from her contemporaries was the obvious psychological gratification she derived from the suffering of others. She created personalized methods of cruelty that went far beyond institutional demands. She capriciously selected prisoners for episodes of sophisticated torture, usually targeting attractive young women whom she interpreted as rivalries for her own vanity. This personal side of her brutality indicates intricate psychological motivations that went beyond the simple fulfillment of responsibilities. Survivors consistently described his distinctive appearance: impeccably pressed uniform, gleaming combat boots, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, and the ubiquitous combination of braided whip and pistol. This deliberate construction of an intimidating image, combined with physical beauty and youth, created a macabre contrast that contributed to his notoriety as the hyena of Auschwitz, or the blonde angel of death. His involvement in the selections for the gas chambers was particularly terrifying. With calculated coldness, he determined who would be sent immediately to their deaths, often separating mothers from their children with absolute indifference to desperate pleas. Witnesses described how he derived psychological pleasure from informing prisoners of their fate, graphically describing the gassing process while observing their reactions. These behaviors suggest a complete internalization of the Nazi dehumanization of the victims, combined with sadistic tendencies that the concentration camp system allowed to express without restriction. Maria Mandel exhibits a different but equally disturbing profile. Born on January 10, 1912, in Münzkirchen, Austria, she was considerably older than Grese when she joined the concentration camp system after the Anschluss in 1938. She began as a guard at Lichtenberg before moving to Ravensbrück, where she displayed administrative and organizational skills that set her apart from her colleagues. In October 1942, Mandel arrived at Auschwitz as SS Lagerführerin, camp commander, the highest position a woman could achieve in the concentration camp hierarchy. As the chief supervisor of the Birkenau women's camp, she had direct authority over approximately 30,000 prisoners and all female guards, reporting solely to Commandant Rudolf Höss. Her combination of bureaucratic efficiency and absolute ideological loyalty made her a key implementer of genocidal policies at Auschwitz. In contrast to Grese, whose sadism was primarily expressed in individual confrontations, Mandel excelled at creating systems that maximized collective suffering with industrial efficiency. He established meticulous protocols for processing incoming shipments, optimizing flows to gas chambers or labor barracks based on criteria of immediate economic utility. He implemented collective punishment schemes where individual infractions resulted in deprivation for entire barracks. He created the infamous Block 25, the prelude to the gas chambers where prisoners selected for death waited for days without food or water, often surrounded by corpses. A particularly disturbing element of Mandel's work was his ability to compartmentalize the systematic brutality he orchestrated, while simultaneously maintaining a semblance of cultural sophistication. He established a female orchestra at Birkenau comprised of female prisoner musicians to perform classical pieces as new transports arrived at the camp or during the daily marches to work. This macabre contrast between Beethoven or Mozart and processions of skeletal prisoners exemplifies the profound moral perversion that characterized the concentration camp system and its perpetrators' capacity to completely dissociate empathy from behavior. Both Grese and Mandel actively participated in the medical experiments carried out at Auschwitz. They personally selected prisoners for procedures by Dr. Josef Mengele and other SS doctors, frequently sending twins, people with physical anomalies, or simply women they disliked. These special selections were practically death sentences, as few survived the inhumane experiments. Their collaboration in these crimes demonstrates a complete internalization of the Nazi view of certain categories of people as expendable experimental material. Following the evacuation of Auschwitz in January 1945, their paths temporarily diverged. Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen along with numerous other prisoners, where her regime of brutality continued until the British liberation in April. Mandel attempted to go into hiding in Bavaria, but was captured by American forces and later extradited to Poland. Both faced trials for crimes against humanity that resulted in death sentences. Greze was executed by hanging on December 13, 1945, in Hameln, becoming the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. Mandel was hanged on January 24, 1948, at Montelupich prison in Krakow. Their cases demonstrate how the Nazi concentration camp system created environments where ordinary individuals could exercise absolute authority without moral constraints, facilitating the manifestation of latent sadistic tendencies or the gradual development of extremely cruel behavior through progressive desensitization. The trajectories of Gresse and Mandel refute simplistic stereotypes about female participation in war crimes, demonstrating that the capacity to perpetrate atrocities transcends gender differences when specific factors of extremist ideology, institutional opportunity, and individual psychological predispositions converge. The art of suffering, the lethal technique of Nazi torture. Nazi concentration camps operated as experimental facilities where torture evolved into a methodical institutional doctrine. Rather than humanizing this apparatus of terror, the female supervisors executed it with devastating effectiveness, frequently displaying personal initiative that exceeded official instructions. These women created and refined systems of suffering that fused direct physical aggression, sophisticated psychological torment, and active intervention in devices of mass annihilation, building an arsenal of cruelty that exploited the specific weaknesses of their victims. A methodical examination of the techniques used reveals consistent configurations that went beyond individual characteristics or variations between fields, indicating institutionalized processes of transferring expertise in effective methods of physical and mental control and destruction. These methodologies can be classified into specific categories that, when integrated, generated a unified apparatus of dehumanization and progressive elimination. Direct physical aggression represented the most obvious expression of the dominance exercised by the supervisors. The whip, a characteristic symbol of authority and panic, became an almost natural extension of many guards who perfected precise methods to intensify pain without causing immediate death. They manufactured customized whips by interlacing specific materials to amplify the severity of the injuries, methodically directing their attacks toward particularly vulnerable areas of the body, such as faces, torsos, or intimate areas. Accounts attest to how the supposedly corrective beatings far exceeded any disciplinary purpose, becoming manifestations of sadism that frequently proved fatal when the previously weakened victims could not withstand the physical trauma. In addition, the supervisors applied methodical corporal punishments designed to break physical and mental resistance. They forced inmates to remain static in painful positions for hours or days, forced them to genuflect over sharp objects, imposed exhausting activities until they collapsed, or deliberately subjected them to extreme temperatures through ice baths during the winter. These corrective punishments were frequently implemented in a group setting, blaming entire groups for individual transgressions, a tactic that fostered suspicion among prisoners and nullified the possibility of solidarity. Total control over fundamental physiological demands constituted another essential facet of applied terror. The supervisors rigorously controlled access to nutrition, fluids, and sanitary facilities, turning vital needs into instruments of control and punishment. They capriciously limited the use of toilets, forcing prisoners to soil themselves and then punishing them for filth. They systematically appropriated food rations from troublesome prisoners, accelerating the process of starvation. During the winter, they denied blankets or appropriate clothing to those they disliked, causing potentially fatal hypothermia. This intentional manipulation of fundamental needs exploited bodily vulnerabilities to break mental resilience. Particularly sophisticated was the application of psychological torment specifically designed to annihilate human identity and dignity. The supervisors forced prisoners to publicly undress for searches, accompanied by humiliating comments, shaved heads, assigned ragged clothing inadequate for basic protection, and created specific humiliations based on identified individual vulnerabilities. They exploited particular cultural or spiritual sensitivities, forcing Orthodox Jewish women to transgress religious commandments or selecting women previously respected in their communities for particularly degrading labor. The methodical humiliation sought to annihilate any remnant of identity or self-esteem that might sustain internal resistance. The exploitation of emotional ties as an instrument of psychological torment reached particularly perverse levels. Supervisors intentionally divided mothers from children, sisters from sisters, and friends from friends, only to later provide falsified or incomplete information about the fates of loved ones. They forced prisoners to observe the torture of family members without allowing them to take any action. They established arbitrary privilege mechanisms that forced close associates to compete for basic resources such as nutrition or medication. These tactics exploited the very thing that preserved the victim's humanity, their emotional ties, and turned it into an additional source of suffering. The instrumental use of animals as instruments of torture constitutes another disturbing facet of the repressive arsenal. Johanna Bormann exemplified this methodology with her dog, specifically trained to attack selected prisoners on command. This technique combined severe physical harm with heightened psychological terror, as the instinctive fear of animal attacks generated particularly intense traumatic reactions in previously weakened individuals. The attacks frequently proved fatal, as bite wounds quickly became infected in the absence of medical attention, leading to fatal septicemia. The imposition of grueling forced labor was a particularly effective method for systematically weakening organisms already compromised by starvation and disease. Supervisors oversaw work crews where they established work rhythms impossible for severely weakened individuals to sustain, beating those who reduced productivity or collapsed from exhaustion. Particularly perverse was the assignment of completely pointless tasks, digging pits and then filling them in, purposelessly moving rocks from one site to another, repeatedly cleaning surfaces that had immediately become dirty, with the sole purpose of destroying any sense of purpose or meaning in the imposed activity. Direct intervention in gas chamber selections was arguably the most destructive form of authority exercised by female supervisors. At Auschwitz and other extermination camps, they decided who would be sent immediately to die and who would be temporarily selected to live. This literal responsibility over life and death was exercised with cold bureaucratic efficiency, assessing in seconds the immediate economic utility of human beings reduced to productive units. The psychological impact was devastating not only for those sent directly to die, but also for those selected to live, permanently scarred by the trauma of survival, as family and friends were led to their deaths. The female supervisors also actively participated in inhumane medical experimentation. They selected subjects for atrocious procedures conducted by SS doctors like Joseph Mengele. Pregnant women, twins, people with unusual physical characteristics, or simply prisoners who had provoked personal dislike were sent to medical blocks where forced sterilizations, implantation of toxic substances, exposure to pathogens, or experimental surgeries without anesthesia were carried out. The supervisors monitored these blocks, ensuring that no experimental subjects escaped. The intentional unpredictability of behaviors and reactions was part of a sophisticated strategy of psychological torment. The supervisors maintained regimes where rules were constantly changed without advance notice, where behaviors tolerated one day could be severely sanctioned the next. This calculated inconsistency prevented prisoners from developing stable adaptive tactics, keeping them in a permanent state of trauma alert. Some supervisors intentionally alternated moments of apparent benevolence with outbursts of extreme violence, without obvious provocation, generating psychologically devastating effects through unpredictable trauma bombardment. What was particularly disturbing about these methodologies was that they were not the random actions of exceptionally cruel individuals, but rather integrated elements of a system designed to completely dehumanize victims before their eventual annihilation. Continued exposure to this regime of brutality was intended to transform prisoners into passive beings, incapable of organized resistance and psychologically prepared to accept their own destruction as inevitable. The supervisors, far from being mere executors of institutional directives, frequently exhibited personal initiative in the refinement and intensification of repressive techniques, competing with each other to demonstrate effectiveness through innovation in cruelty. The Bergen-Belsen trials and the fate of the wardens. The moment British forces captured Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, marked the beginning of a revolutionary legal process that would cement essential principles for international law. Unlike other complexes abandoned hastily or demolished to erase compromising evidence, Bergen-Belsen fell into Allied hands with a large proportion of its personnel still on the premises, including several supervisors who had failed in their escape attempt. The catastrophic prospects confronting the liberators, more than 10,000 unburied corpses, inmates dying of starvation and epidemics, wards overcrowded with individuals reduced to walking skeletons, led to an immediate resolve to bring those responsible for such atrocities to justice. The British commanders acted swiftly, arresting all SS personnel located there, including Commandant Josef Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, as well as supervisors such as Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, Johanna Bormann, and Herta Botha. As an initial action, the British compelled these guards to intervene in the sanitation of the complex, moving rotting corpses to mass graves. Photographic images of supervisors moving emaciated bodies evolved into iconic representations that captured the initial stage of accountability for the atrocities carried out. The Bergen-Belsen trial, formally titled The Trial of Josef Kramer and Others, opened on September 17, 1945 in Lüneburg under British military authority. This case symbolized one of the pioneering systematic efforts to prosecute Holocaust atrocities, creating a significant precedent for subsequent Nuremberg trials. Its significance lay not only in trying specific individuals, but also in meticulously recording the essence of the atrocities perpetrated at the complexes, establishing verifiable historical documentation of atrocities that would later become part of the documentary heritage of the Holocaust. Among the 45 defendants were 16 women, predominantly SS supervisors who had operated at Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, and other complexes. The British military tribunal faced unprecedented legal challenges, developing legal frameworks to judge atrocities committed by German citizens against other Germans or nationals of occupied territories in areas outside British authority. The solution implemented consisted of prosecuting them on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity, emerging concepts in international law that materialized precisely as a legal response to Nazi atrocities. The preparation of the case against the supervisors required an exceptional investigative effort. British squads interrogated hundreds of survivors scattered across Europe, many of whom were still hospitalized or in displaced persons facilities. These accounts provided specific details about each supervisor's individual behavior, making it easier to establish personal culpability beyond the claim of following directives. The prosecution presented evidence that included first-hand accounts, documentation recovered from the complex's archives, signed directives, records of sanctions, and photographic material recording circumstances discovered after the release. The defendants' defensive tactics followed predictable configurations. Most argued compliance with higher directives, Befehlsnotstand, a claim systematically dismissed by the court when evidence showed personal initiative in the implementation of cruelty. Some acknowledged minor offenses while rejecting more severe accusations. Many attempted to minimize knowledge of the overall purpose of the concentration camp system or their understanding of the causal connection between imposed circumstances and high mortality rates. On November 17, 1945, after 2 months of testimony and deliberations, the court delivered its verdicts. 11 defendants, including Josef Kramer, Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann, were sentenced to death. 14 received prison sentences ranging from life imprisonment to shorter terms. 14 were exonerated due to insufficient evidence. The sentencing parameters reflected both the individual severity of the atrocities and the level of direct culpability established by verifiable evidence. A decisive factor in capital sentences was prior involvement in Auschwitz. Supervisors who had worked at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen generally received harsher sentences than those who only worked at Bergen-Belsen, with the court finding that involvement in industrialized extermination constituted a particularly aggravating circumstance. This parameter generated controversy among survivors, who argued that the specific brutality of each supervisor, regardless of the complex where they worked, should be a determining factor. The executions took place on December 13, 1945, at the Hameln prison. Irma Grese, Elisabeth Volkenrath, and Johanna Bormann were hanged on the same day, making Grese the youngest woman executed under British law in the 20th century. The executions were directed by Albert Pierrepoint, the official British executioner who later recorded these proceedings in official documents. The supervisors who obtained prison sentences met with varying fates. Herta Botha, initially sentenced to 10 years, was released early in December 1951 as part of a general policy of commuting sentences for war criminals. Others, such as Hilda Michaelis and Gertrude Fiest, suffered similar fates. This early release reflected the changing political environment at the beginning of the Cold War, as West Germany became a strategic ally against the Soviet bloc, generating pressure to normalize relations through the early release of war criminals. The vast majority of female supervisors never faced legal repercussions. Of the approximately 3,500 women who operated as Aufseherinnen in the concentration camp system, only a tiny fraction were prosecuted. Many managed to blend in with the millions of displaced people, changing their identities or simply returning to anonymous existences in places where their history was unknown. The capture of Bergen-Belsen with personnel present symbolized the exception rather than the rule. Most complexes were evacuated well in advance to facilitate the escape of the perpetrators. The tracking of those who initially evaded justice reveals inconsistencies in post-Holocaust accountability. Some, like Hermine Braunsteiner, the mayor of Majdanek, emigrated to countries like the United States and Canada, using false identities or concealing their criminal history. Braunsteiner was finally identified in 1964, living as a housewife in Queens, New York. After a lengthy extradition process, she was tried in Germany and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1981, almost 4 decades after her atrocities. The legal legacy of trials like Bergen-Belsen was considerable despite their limitations. They established a precedent for the prosecution of atrocities against humanity under Allied military authority, paving the way for the Nuremberg tribunals and subsequent proceedings. More importantly, they created a detailed legal record of atrocities through cross-examination and documentary evidence, meticulously recording the systematic essence of the Nazi genocide. These evidentiary records have proven essential for historians and for historical documentation of the Holocaust. Possibly the most transcendental legal principle established was the categorical rejection of compliance with directives as an excuse for culpability for atrocities against humanity. This Nuremberg principle, later formally codified in proceedings against key Nazi leaders, began to materialize in trials against Bergen-Belsen personnel. The supervisors were found guilty not only of implementing institutional directives, but also of personal initiative evidenced by the implementation of cruelty and of voluntary intervention in a manifestly criminal apparatus. Voices from the Abyss, testimonies exposing Nazi cruelty. Survivors' accounts formed the essential basis upon which the cases against the concentration camp supervisors were built. These statements, presented during proceedings at Bergen-Belsen, Ravensbrück, and other trials, offer detailed and verifiable descriptions of atrocities, transcending their immediate legal value to become fundamental historical records. Through these accounts, detailed documentation emerged of the systematic brutality carried out by women who had been an integral part of the Nazi concentration camp apparatus. The compilation of these accounts represented an exceptional logistical challenge in ruined post-war Europe. British, American, and Soviet investigators crisscrossed the continent, locating scattered survivors, many of whom were seriously ill or convalescing in makeshift hospitals. The procedure required cross-checking accounts, verifying identities through photographs, and carefully assessing the reliability of each statement. This precision was essential in the face of defensive tactics that would attempt to discredit accounts by claiming confusion, exaggeration, or inaccuracy regarding specific identities. Evidentiary reliability was significantly enhanced when independent accounts from unconnected individuals of different nationalities and backgrounds described consistent patterns of behavior. Particularly valuable were accounts with verifiable specificities, exact dates, precise descriptions of locations within camps, names of other victims or witnesses, and idiosyncratic details about defendants that could only be learned through direct contact. Elisabeth Katzenstein, a survivor of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, provided a detailed account against Irma Gräser. Her statement accurately described punitive practices that Gräser had personally implemented. Katzenstein recounted an incident where Grese brutally beat a pregnant Hungarian prisoner to the point of miscarriage, subsequently denying her medical care, resulting in her death from sepsis. The accuracy of these details and consistency with other independent accounts made her statement especially significant as evidence in court. Luba Trzynska, a Polish nurse who worked in the Bergen-Belsen infirmary, testified about Elizabeth Volkenrath's direct involvement in creating lethal conditions. She described how Volkenrath systematically appropriated medications intended for the sick, prohibited the provision of additional rations to malnourished patients, and carried out selections within the infirmary, sending weakened patients to unsupervised wards where they inevitably died. As a health professional, Trzynska established direct causal connections between Volkenrath's administrative decisions and the resulting deaths. Particularly valuable were the accounts of former inmates who had held administrative responsibilities within the camps, clerks, translators, or medical personnel with access to internal information about the operation of the camps. Rachela Kieliszek, a translator for the Bergen-Belsen administration, testified about conversations between Elizabeth Volkenrath and Josef Kramer, in which they discussed reducing rations to hasten deaths in overcrowded sections, directly contradicting Volkenrath's claims of ignorance of the connection between dietary restrictions and mortality. The accounts were not limited to Jewish survivors. Witnesses such as Catherine Neiger, an Austrian political prisoner categorized as asocial by the Nazi regime, provided complementary perspectives on the brutality of female supervisors. Neiger described how Herta Botha specifically targeted non-Jewish inmates for exemplary punishment, contradicting the defensive narrative of passive implementation of top-down anti-Semitic policies. These accounts established that the defendant's cruelty transcended ideological motivations, revealing systematic patterns of violent behavior directed toward any inmate under her supervision. Although less numerous, accounts from former guards were equally significant. Faced with the certainty of their own convictions, some male SS members provided incriminating statements against female supervisors. Otto Stoppel, an SS guard at Bergen-Belsen, testified on his own initiative that Volkenrath and Grese exhibited particularly severe punishment designs, directly contradicting the defense based on following directives. These accounts from within the apparatus proved especially difficult to refute. The judicial presentation of these accounts required procedural sensitivity. Numerous survivors experienced intense reactions when reliving experiences or directly confronting former supervisors. Prosecutors developed techniques to facilitate statements while minimizing procedural interruptions, allowing written accounts when direct confrontation was impossible, or carefully preparing witnesses for court proceedings. Some accounts had to be interrupted when witnesses suffered decompensation during testimony, evidence in itself of the impact of the atrocities being prosecuted. Testimonial evidence was complemented by documentary and forensic evidence. Personnel records showed the trajectory of female supervisors through the concentration camp apparatus, contradicting claims of short periods of service or ignorance of the overall purpose. Signed directives, inmate lists, and sanction records provided corroborating contemporary evidence. Particularly valuable were medical records documenting causes of death fabricated to conceal violent causes. Photographic evidence played a crucial evidentiary role. Images captured by liberators provided visual context for the atrocities being prosecuted. Identification photographs allowed witnesses to positively confirm the identity of specific defendants. Photographs recovered from the personal possessions of supervisors, displayed in social contexts within the same camps where thousands died daily, illustrated the incongruity between the conditions of inmates and camp staff. Medical accounts constituted a critical evidentiary category. British military doctors who treated survivors immediately after liberation testified about physical conditions consistent with descriptions of specific abuse. Dr. Charles Matheson documented scarring patterns on survivors that precisely matched descriptions of instruments used by specific supervisors. These accounts established direct causal connections between specific supervisors' actions and verifiable physical harm, reinforcing the credibility of survivors' accounts. The evidentiary impact of these stories transcended their emotional value. The statements transformed abstract statistics into concrete documented records, establishing causal chains between individual actions and specific consequences. When Sigismund Shalomsky described specific procedures implemented by Irma Gräser, he provided verifiable details that made it possible to reconstruct chains of command and responsibility within the camp apparatus. The gender-specific dimension of the accounts consistently emerged. The narratives revealed particular forms of mistreatment directed specifically toward female inmates. Jacqueline Wojcicki described how some supervisors deliberately targeted pregnant women for punishments that resulted in abortions. Franziska Mann recounted humiliating inspection procedures implemented specifically for female inmates. These accounts documented specific practices implemented by supervisors against female inmates. The international character of the accounts reflected the multinational nature of the Holocaust. Survivors from Poland, Hungary, France, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Italy, Greece, Russia, and other nations provided accounts, often through interpreters. This diversity illustrated the pan-European scope of Nazi persecution and hampered defensive attempts to characterize incidents as isolated or exceptional. The consistency of narratives from such diverse individuals reinforced the overall credibility of the presented case. The defendant's own statements constituted another crucial form of evidence. During interrogations, supervisors like Gräser and Volkenrath frequently contradicted each other, initially denying knowledge of mass deaths and then later admitting to some incidents. Particularly revealing were moments where they inadvertently admitted previously denied knowledge, such as when Johanna Bormann, after denying familiarity with gassing, described the process in detail during cross-examination, revealing knowledge of procedures they had supposedly ignored. Judicial inspections of Bergen-Belsen provided essential physical context for evaluating accounts. Although partially modified after liberation, the camp remained substantially as described by witnesses. Judges verified distances mentioned in accounts, confirmed sight lines from guard posts, and assessed the conditions of the described cells. These visits allowed for a realistic evaluation of defensive claims of ignorance of specific conditions, demonstrating the physical impossibility of not noticing situations such as extreme overcrowding or accumulation of corpses referred to in accounts. For many survivors, testifying symbolized an act of historical documentation. Publicly recounting previously undocumented experiences validated silenced suffering and contributed to the official historical record. Ilse Stephan, who testified against Herta Botte, later expressed that her testimony symbolized a contribution to the historical documentation of events that might otherwise have gone unrecorded. The act of testimony constituted a fundamental contribution to the documentary record of the Holocaust. The public impact of these accounts was considerable. Newspaper reports of judicial pronouncements circulated globally, instrumental in the initial public documentation of the Holocaust. As governments and international organizations began to legally conceptualize the notion of barbarities against humanity, these accounts provided concrete examples necessary for developing appropriate legal frameworks. The specificity of statements against supervisors helped establish that responsibility for atrocities included direct perpetrators, regardless of rank or hierarchical position. The historical value of these accounts far transcends their immediate judicial purpose. They constitute fundamental records that preserve direct documentation of atrocities that might otherwise have been diluted into statistical abstractions. Decades later, they continue to provide invaluable primary material for researchers, educators, and historical documentarians. Their specificity and detail effectively counter revisionist narratives that attempt to minimize the reality or scale of the atrocities perpetrated during the Holocaust. The Dark Legacy, the shadow of the guardians in history. The apparatus of female supervisors at Nazi concentration camps constitutes a significant episode in the historical documentation of the Holocaust, enriching the understanding of the organizational structure of the genocide carried out by the Nazi regime. After more than 7 decades, research on these women continues to provide documentary insights into the practical functioning of the concentration camp apparatus and women's involvement in the direct execution of repressive policies. Historical records show a significant demographic composition of the female supervisor contingent. During the height of the concentration camp system, approximately 3,500 women operated as Aufseherinnen spread across various camps and subsidiary facilities throughout occupied Europe. This female group represented an essential element of the camp administrative staff. especially in the supervision of female sectors, where female inmates constituted a growing percentage of the concentration camp population, particularly after the intensification of mass deportations in 1944. Administrative documentation recovered after the war helps reconstruct the institutional trajectories of female supervisors within the apparatus. Contrary to initial assumptions, biographical information compiled in SS personnel records reveals significant diversity in the recruitment profile. Analysis of these records indicates that the majority came from working-class or lower-middle-class socioeconomic backgrounds with basic education and often prior work experience in the service, industrial, or agricultural sectors. This information contradicts initial hypotheses about exclusive recruitment among previously marginalized women. Preparation records recovered from the Ravensbrück archives document a methodical training system implemented for new candidates. The administrative documents specify a 4-week training program that included ideological indoctrination, instruction on camp hierarchies and administrative procedures, control and contingency management techniques, and supervised practical training. This documentation demonstrates the systematic and institutionalized nature of the process of incorporating female supervisors into the concentration camp apparatus, refuting initial characterizations of the process as an improvised or peripheral phenomenon. A comparative examination of court records, administrative documentation, and records of intercamp transfers makes it possible to reconstruct chains of command and responsibility specific to specific female sections of the camps. SS administrative archives show how senior supervisors such as Maria Mandel held defined positions within the hierarchical structure, with substantial administrative authority over subordinate personnel and specific sections of the camp. These records document formal chains of directive transmission and supervision, contextualizing individual actions within a broader organizational structure. Particularly relevant is the documentation on the evolution of the female supervisor apparatus over time. Personnel records show how recruitment intensified significantly after 1943, coinciding with the general expansion of the concentration camp apparatus and the growing personnel needs due to the transfer of male guards to the military front. This quantitative information allows us to contextualize female participation within the general evolution of the Nazi apparatus and the specific operational requirements during the final stages of the conflict. Recent historical studies have contrasted administrative records with court accounts to assess the degree of operational autonomy exercised by female supervisors. This comparative methodology reveals how, within the general guidelines established by camp commands, female supervisors frequently implemented personal interpretations of the scope and severity of disciplinary measures, demonstrating significant scope for individual initiative within institutional parameters. This documentation contradicts later justifications based solely on following orders. Documentary evidence of female supervisors' involvement in selection is especially significant historically. Administrative records from Auschwitz combined with court records and medical reports establish the formal involvement of senior supervisors such as Mandel and Volkenrath in selection procedures for gas chambers, with direct responsibility for designating inmates for special treatment, administrative terminology for execution. This documentation formalizes direct responsibility for the implementation of exterminationist policies. Post-war court archives provide an essential documentary corpus on the individual actions of female supervisors. The files from the Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück trials and numerous subsequent trials contain detailed transcripts of accounts, evidence presented, interrogations and cross-examinations, reasoned convictions, and subsequent appeals. This court documentation constitutes an irreplaceable primary source for the historical reconstruction of specific actions, offering direct documentary evidence of events verified through adversarial proceedings with basic procedural guarantees. Additionally, the recovered photographic documentation provides direct visual evidence of female supervisors in their operational context. Official identification photographs, images recovered from personal possessions, and especially photographic material generated during camp liberation constitute visual records that complement written documentation. Particularly significant are photographic series documenting female supervisors' involvement in the post-liberation cleanup of Bergen-Belsen, providing a direct visual connection between perpetrators and documented consequences of their actions. The subsequent judicial treatment of supervisory courts reveals a historical evolution in the legal conceptualization of mass atrocities. The procedural documentation of the first trials, 1945 to 1947, exhibits pioneering application of emerging concepts such as atrocities against humanity, while later proceedings, 1950 to 1980, reflect progressive refinement of legal frameworks, incorporating new developments in international law and adjusting to changing political circumstances. This documented evolution illustrates the historical development of judicial responses to unprecedented atrocities. Trial records document significant disparities in judicial accountability. While high-profile figures such as Gries and Mandel received swiftly executed capital sentences, judicial statistics reveal how the majority of supervisors were never prosecuted, while those convicted often received reduced sentences through amnesties or early release. Documentation of subsequent extradition proceedings, such as the Hermine Braunsteiner case, 1973-1981, demonstrates temporal continuity in judicial efforts, but also practical limitations in the universal implementation of justice. The archives of narratives constitute a documentary heritage of exceptional historical value. Detailed statements from survivors, often accompanied by supporting documentation such as contemporary drawings, personal diaries, or recovered correspondence, provide an irreplaceable insider's perspective on everyday life under the concentration camp regime. This corpus of testimony, preserved in court archives and later in collections such as the Fortunoff Video Archive, the USC Shoah Foundation, and Yad Vashem, continues to serve as a primary documentary source for historical research. Historically, the specific study of female supervisors has evolved significantly. Pioneering work focusing primarily on prominent figures such as Gries and Mandel has given way to broader research that systematically analyzes the female component of concentration camp personnel as a functional group within the Nazi apparatus. Recent studies, such as those by Wendy Lower and Claudia Kunz, have contextualized female supervisors within the broader framework of female participation in various structures of the National Socialist regime, documenting specific organizational continuities and particularities. Documentation of the subsequent integration of former supervisors into post-war societies raises historical questions about institutional and social continuities after 1945. Denazification records, labor reintegration files, and documentation on cases such as Herta Botha, who lived until 2000 and occasionally provided interviews about her experience, illustrate complex processes of transition to democratic structures, while significant personal and institutional continuities from the Nazi period persisted. The preservation and accessibility of documentation on female concentration camp supervisors is an essential component of Holocaust memorial infrastructure. From specialized archives such as those maintained by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, and the Memorial de la Shoah, to digital resources that allow global access to previously dispersed documentation, institutional efforts to preserve the documentary record ensure the availability of primary sources for continued historical research and public education about female participation in the implementation of the Nazi genocide. The documentary study of camp supervisors has generated significant methodological contributions for historical research on perpetrators. The inherent complexity of reconstructing specific motivations and circumstances has encouraged the development of integrative methodologies that combine analysis of administrative documentation, survivor accounts, court records, and the broader socio-political context. This multidimensional approach has enriched historical understanding of the practical functioning of the concentration camp apparatus and the processes of direct implementation of institutionalized violence. Historical documentation on camp supervisors serves a fundamental function as a factual counterweight to revisionist tendencies. The extensive testimonial archive, combined with administrative documentation and judicial records verified through adversarial procedures, provides a solid documentary foundation that resists attempts to minimize or deny the historical reality of the Holocaust. This testimonial function of the historical record preserves documented memory of key 20th century events for future generations.